Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 10. Other opportunities of making her observations could not fail to occur. Anne had been soon in company with all the four together, often enough to have an opinion, though too wise to acknowledge that much at home, where she knew it to have satisfied neither husband nor wife. For while she considered Louisa to be rather the favourite, she could not but think, as far as she might dare to judge from the memory and experience, the Captain Wentworth was not in love with either. There was more love with him, but yet it was not love. It was a fever of admiration, but it might, probably must, end in love with some. Charles Hayter seemed aware of being slighted, and yet Henrietta had sometimes the air of being divided between them, and had longed for the power of representing to them what they were all about. In pointing out some of the evils that were exposing themselves to, she did not attribute guilt to any. It was satisfaction to her to believe that Captain Wentworth was not in the least aware of pain he was occasioning. There was no triumph, no pitiful triumph in this manner. He had, probably, never heard, and never thought of any claims of Charles Hayter. He was only wrong in accepting the attentions, for accepting must be the word, of two women at once. After a short struggle, however, Charles Hayter seemed to quit the field. 3 days had passed without his coming at once to Uppercross, a most decided change. He had even refused one regular invitation to dinner, and having found on the occasion of Miss Musgrove with some large books before him, Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove were all sure not to be right, and talked with grave faces of studying himself to death. It was Mary's hope and belief that he received a positive dismissal from Henrietta. Her husband lived under the constant dependence of seeing him tomorrow. Anne could only feel that Charles Hayter was wise. One morning, about this Charles Musgrove and Captain Wentworth being gone a-shooting together, as the sisters in the cottage were sitting quietly at work, they were visited at the window by the sisters of the Mansion House. It was a very fine November day, and the Miss Musgroves came to the little grounds, and stopped for no other purposes than to say they were going to take a long walk, and therefore concluded Mary would not like to go with them, when Mary immediately replied, with some jealousy of not being a good walker, "Oh, yes, I should like to join, thank you very much. I'm very fond of a long walk," and felt persuaded, by the looks of the two girls, that was precisely what they did not wish, and admired again the sort of necessity which the family habits seemed to produce, of everything being to communicated, and everything being to done with another. However undesired and inconvenient, she tried to dissuade Mary from going, but in vain. That being the case, though it best to accept Miss Musgrove's the more cordial invitation to herself to go likewise, and she might be useful in turning back with her sister, and lessening the interference in any plan of their own. "I cannot imagine why they should suppose I would not like a long walk," said Mary, as she went upstairs. "Everybody's always supposing that I am not a good walker, and yet they would not have been pleased if I refused to join them. When people come in this manner on purpose to ask us, how can one say no?" They were just setting off. The gentlemen returned. They had taken out a young dog who had spoiled their sport, and sent them back early. Their time and strength and spirits were, therefore, exactly ready for this walk, and entered into a pleasure Anne could only foresee in such a junction that it would miss stayed at home. But for some feelings of interest and curiosity, she fancied now that it was too late to retract, and the whole six set forward together in the direction chosen by Miss Musgroves, who evidently considered the walk as under their guidance. Anne's object was not to be in the way of anybody, and where the narrow paths on the field made many separations necessary to keep with her brother and sister, her pleasures in the walk must arise from the exercise and the day, from the view of last miles of year in tawny leaves and withered hedges, from repeating to herself a very few thousand poetical descriptions extant of autumn, and the season particular an inexhaustible influence on the mind, taste, and tenderness, that season which had drawn from every poet, worthy of being read, some types of description, some lines of feeling. She occupied her mind as much as possible in such like musings and quotations. It was not possible that within reach of Captain Wentworth's conversation with either of the Miss Musgroves, she did not try to hear it. Yet she caught little very remarkable. It was a mere lively chat, such as any persons on an intimate footing might fall into. He was more engaged with Louisa than with Henrietta, and Louisa certainly put more forward for his notice than her sister. This distinction added to the increase, which was one speech Louisa which struck her, after one day of many praises, which were continually bursting forth. Captain Wentworth added, "What a glorious weather for the Admiral and my sister! They take a long drive, but we must ail to them from these hills. They talked into coming this side of the country. I wonder what are the whereabouts. Oh, it does happen very often, I assure you, but my sister makes nothing of it, as she would as leave as taught out as not." "Ah, you make the most of it, I know," cried Louisa, "but if it were really so, I would just do the same in her place. If I loved a man, and as she loved the Admiral, I would always be with him. Nothing should ever separate us. I'd rather be overturned by him than driven safely by anyone else." It was spoke with enthusiasm. "Had you?" cried he, catching the same tone. "I honored you." And there was a silence between them for a little while. It could not immediately fall into quotation. The sweet scenes of autumn were for a while put by, unless some tender sonnet fraught with that apt analogy of declining year with declining happiness, and the images of youth, hope, and spring, all gone together, blessed with her memory. She raised herself to say, as if they had struck by order into another path, "Is this not one of the ways to Winthrop?" But nobody heard, or at least nobody answered her. Winthrop, however, was in environs, for young men are sometimes to be met with. Strolling near home was their destination, and after another half of gradual ascent, they through the large enclosures where was the plows at work, and fresh-made path spoke the farmer counteracting his sweet and poetical despondence. In meaning to have spring again, they gained the summit of the most considerable hill, in which part of Uppercross and Winthrop, and soon commanded a full view of the latter, and at the foot of the hill on the other side, Winthrop, without the beauty and without dignity, was stretched before them. An indifferent house, standing low, hemmed between the bars in the buildings of the farmyard. Mary exclaimed, "Bless me! Here's Winthrop! I declare I had no idea. Well, we better turn back. I'm excessively tired." Henrietta, conscious and ashamed, seeing no cousin Charles along walk of any path, or leaning against any gate, was to do as Mary wished. "But no!" Charles Munger. "No, no!" cried Louisa more eagerly, and taking her sister aside, seemed to be arguing with them warmly. Charles, in meanwhile, was very decidedly declaring his resolutions on calling his aunt, so that he was so near, and very evidently, though more fearfully, trying to induce his wife to go too. But this was one of the points in which the lady shewed her strength, and recommended the advantage of resting herself a quarter of an hour at Winthrop. As she felt so tired, she resolutely answered, "Oh, no, indeed! Waking up that hill again would do her more harm than sitting down could do her good." And in short, her look and manner declared that she would not go. A little succession of these short debates and consultations, it was settled between Charles and the two sisters, that he and Henrietta should run down aloud for a few minutes, and see their aunt and cousins, while the rest of the party waited for them at the top of the hill. Louisa seemed the principal arranger of the plan, and she went a little way with them. Down the hill, still talking to Henrietta, Mary took most of the opportunity to look scornfully around her, and saying to Captain Wentworth, "It is very unpleasant, having such connections, but I assure you, I have never been in the house above twice in my life." She received no other answer than an artificial assenting smile, followed by a contemptuous glance. Then he turned away, which Anne perfectly knew the meaning of. The brow of the hill which they remained was a cheerful spot. Louisa returned, and Mary, finding a comfortable seat for herself on the step of the stile, was very well satisfied as long as the others all stood about her. But when Louisa drew Captain Wentworth away to try the gleaning of nuts in the adjoining hedgerow, they were still gone by degrees and quite out of sight and sound. Mary was happy no longer, and she quarrelled with her own seat. She was sure Louisa had gotten better somewhere, but nothing could prevent her from going to look for a better also. She could also go through the same gate, but not see with them, and found a nice seat for her and the dry sunny bank, under the hedgerow, which she had no doubt of still being. In some spot or other, Mary sat down for a moment, but it would not do, for sure Louisa was better seat somewhere, and would go on till she overtook her. Anne, really tired of herself, was glad to sit down. She very soon heard Captain Wentworth and Louisa in the hedgerow behind her. If making their way back along the row, while through the channel down the centre, they were speaking as they drew near. Louisa's voice was the first distinguished, and seemed to be in the middle of some eager speech. What Anne first heard was, "And so I made her go, and I could not bear that she could be frightened from the visit by such nonsense. What! Would I be turned back from doing a thing I determined to do so, and that I had a right to be right, by the errors in the interference of such person, or of any person, I may say? No, I have not been so easily persuaded. What it made up my mind, I have made it. Henrietta seemed entirely to make up her call at Winthrop today, and she was giving it an air of nonsensical compliance. She would have turned back. But for you, she would indeed. I am also ashamed to say it. Happy for her to have such a mind as yours at hand. And after all the hints you gave just now, which duly did confirm my own observations, which last time I was in time with him, I need not affect so comprehension of what is going on. I knew the mere dutiful morning visit to your aunt's was in question, and woe betide him. In her, too, when it comes to things of consequence, which they are placed in circumstance requiring fortitude and strength of mind, it would not resolution enough to resist the idle interferences like this. Your sister is a mild creature, but yours in character of decision and firmness I see, if you value conductive happiness, infuse of much your own spirit as you can. But this, no doubt, you have always been doing. It is the worst of evil, too yielding and incisive a character, and no influence could be depended on. You were never such a good impression of being durable. Everybody may sway at it, and let those who would be happy be firm. Here's a nut. And he, catching one from the other bow, to exemplify a beautiful glossy nut, which was blessed with the original strength and outlived the storms of autumn. Not a puncture, nor a weak spot anywhere. This night, he continued, with plenty of solemnity, while so many of this brethren had fallen trodden under foot, it is still in possession of all happiness that a hazel nut can suppose be capable of. Then, returning to his former careless tone, earnest tone, my first wish is that for whom I am interested in, they should all be firm. If Louisa Mungrove was to be beautiful and happy in her November life, she will charge all her present powers of mind. He had done, and was unanswered. It would surprise Anne if Louisa had been readily answered with such a speech, and such a word of interest, spoken with such serious warmth. She could imagine what Louisa was feeling for herself. She feared to move, and she could be seen, while she remained, a bush of rambling holly protected her. They were moving on. Before they were beyond her hearing, however, Louisa spoke again. "Mary is good-natured and well enough of many respects, but she does provoke me excessively, and to nonsense the Elliot pride. She has a great deal too much of the Elliot pride. Wished to do that to Charles as he married Anne soon. I suppose you know he wanted to marry Anne." After a moment's pause, Captain Wentworth said, "Do you mean she refused him?" "Oh, yes, certainly." "When that happened?" "I do not know exactly, for Henrietta was in school at that time, and I believe that a year before he got married. I wish he accepted him, and we all liked her great deal better. Papa and Mamma would have think her a great friend of Lady Russell's doing, but she did not. She think Charles would not be learned and bookish enough to please Lady Russell, and therefore she persuaded Anne to refuse him." The sounds were retreating, and Anne, having distinguished no more, her own emotions still kept her fixed, and she much recovered from, before she could move. The listener's proverbial fate was absolutely not hers. She had no evil of herself, but she had heard a great deal of painful import. She saw how her own character was considered by Captain Wentworth, and there had been just a good degree of feeling curiosity about her in this manner, in which gave her extreme agitation. She, as soon as she could, went after Mary, and having found walked back with her former station by the sterile, and felt some comfort in the whole party being immediately afterwards collected. Once more in a motion together, her spirits wanted solitude and silence, for only which numbers could give. Charles and Henrietta returned, bringing as much as may be conjured Charles Hayter with them. A minutiae of business, and Anne could not attempt to understand. Even Captain Wentworth did not seem to admit the perfect coincidence here, that there seemed to be a withdrawing on the gentleman's side, and relenting on the ladies', and that was now very glad to be together, and did not admit a doubt. Henrietta seemed a little ashamed, but very well pleased. Charles Hayter exceedingly happy, and were devoted to each other almost from the first instant of all their setting forwards from Uppercross. Everything now marked Louisa for Captain Wentworth. Nothing could be plainer, in which many divisions were necessary, or even when they were not, walked side by side nearly as much as the other two. In a long strip of the meadowland, which there seemed to be ample space for all, they were thus divided, forming three distinct parties, into that party of the three which boasts least ammunition, in compliance, and necessarily belonged. She joined Charles and Mary, and she was tired enough to be glad of Charles's other arm. But Charles, though in very good humour with her, was out of her temper with wife, and Mary, sure herself disobliging him, was not to reap the consequences, in which consequences which him dropping her arm almost every moment to cut off their heads with some nettles of the hedge with the switch. And when Mary began to complain of it, and lament with her being ill used, according to custom, in being on the hedge side, and while Anne was never a comment of the other, he dropped the arm of both to hunt after a weasel, which he, at momentary glance of, could hardly get along. This meadow of borderland, which her was for her footpath, and at the end was the cross, when the party had reached the gate, and the carriage, of having advanced on the same direction, which was some time to be heard, was coming up, and improved Admiral Croft's gig. He and his wife had taken their intended drive, and was returning home upon hearing how a long walk the young people had engaged in. They were kindly offered a seat to any lady who might be particularly tired, and might save her a full mile, and they were going through Uppercross. The invitation was general, and generally declined, and Miss Mungrove was not tired at all. Mary was either offended, or not being asked by any of the others, or what Louisa could call the Elliot pride could not endure to make a third in this one-horse chaise. The walking party had crossed the lane, and was surmounting on the opposite stile. The Admiral was putting his horse in motion again, and Captain Wentworth cleared the hedge in a moment to say something to his sister. He said, they said something that might be guessed in effects. "Miss Elliot, I am sure you are tired," cried Miss Croft. "Please let us do the pleasure of taking you home. Here is excellent room for you three, I assure you. If we were all like you, I would believe we might sit four. You must, indeed, you must." Anne was still in the lane, though instinctively of being to declined, and she was not allowed to proceed. The Admiral's kind urgency came from the poor they would be refused, and compressed themselves in the small possible space to leave her in a corner. And the Captain Wentworth, without saying a word, and turned to her, and quietly obliged her to be assisting into the carriage. She had done it, and she was in the carriage. She felt that he had placed her there, and his will in his hands had done it. She owed this to her perception of her fatigue, and his resolution to give her rest. She was very much affected with the view of his disposition towards her, and all these things made her apparent. And those circumstances seemed to be the completion of all that had gone through. She very much understood him, and could not forgive her. And she was off the unfeeling, though condemned her for the past, and considering it with a high and unjust resentment, though perfectly careless of her, and seeing becoming attached to one another. She could not see her suffer, and without the desire of giving her relief, it was a remainder of the four compounded pleasure and pain. She knew not which prevailed, and her answers to the kindness and remarks of companions were first unconsciously given. They travelled half their way across the rough lane, and before she was quite awake to hear anything what they said, they found them talking of Frederick. "He certainly means to have other of those two girls, Sophy," cried the Admiral. "There is no saying which. He is running after them for too long, too, and long enough, one would end up think to make up his mind. Ay, come this peace. If it were war now, he would have settled it long ago. We sailors, Miss Elliot, cannot afford to make long courtships in time of war. How many days with it, my dear? It was from the first time of seeing you on our sit-down together at our lodging at North Yarmouth. We better not talk about it, my dear," cried Mrs Croft. For Miss Elliot were to hear about how you soon came to an understanding, she would not be persuaded that we would be happy together. If I had known you by character, however, so long before, and I had heard you as a very pretty girl, what was there to be waited for besides? I cannot having such things along in your hand. I could wish Frederick would spread a little more canvas, and bring us home in one of these home equal these one ladies to Kellogg. There would be much more company for them. And nice young ladies they both are, I hardly know from one another. Very good humours, unaffected girls, indeed, cried Mrs. Croft, in a tone of calmer praise, that made Anne suspect that her keener powers might not consider each of them as quite worthy of her brother. In very respectable family one could not be connected with better people. My dear Admiral, that post! We shall certainly take that post. But by cruelly taking the reins of being a better direction herself than they happily passed the danger, and went afterward judiciously putting out her hand, and neither fell into a rut, nor ran out foul of Dunkard, and Anne, with some amusement at their style of driving, which she would know had bad representation of general guidance of their affairs, found her safely deposited by them at the cottage.